how would you describe the voice, the representation of the global South in the global media and opinion landscape? Are you happy with the state of affairs now?
Well, clearly we see that in the Western media, there is a lot of bias, and the presentation of the Global South in the Western media is very propagandistic. So first of all, the Western media acts as though the Global South is largely irrelevant. I mean, when we're talking about the conflicts in Ukraine, the US government constantly talks about the idea of the so-called international community, in scare quotes. And when it says that, it really means the US, Canada, Europe, and Australia and New Zealand. Maybe they'll throw in Japan and South Korea, but they ignore the vast majority of the global population, which is in the Global South. And we see that same bias reflected in the Western media. And furthermore, when there is coverage of the Western media, there's often a kind of racist, patronizing perspective that portrays countries in the Global South as authoritarian, in scare quotes, and portrays the West as supposedly democratic in counterbalance against the Global South. And unfortunately, what it really shows is that despite the fact that these Western powers claim that they ended colonialism several decades ago, that colonialist mentality still very much lives on, especially in the media.
Let's talk about your latest effort. You are running a news website called Multipolarista. Some headline stories that I grabbed include Pakistan's prime minister accuses U.S. diplomat of conspiracy to overthrow his elected government. And then on this website, you also run a story that says sanctions violate human rights and should be lifted, says UN Human Rights Council. German EU official uses racist rhetoric, claiming Russians don't value life. And Venezuela's economy will grow 20% in 2022 despite illegal U.S. sanctions, predicts Western Bank. Obviously, these stories will not be heard in Western media. So what I'm really interested in asking you is, why do you think Western media ignore these stories? Do you blame the Western reporters themselves who might be exercising, say, self-censorship? Or it is the, let's say, editorial environment they're in, where they only pick certain stories, where reporters feel obliged to go with the flow? Or maybe it's the Western audience who want to hear certain things from their reporters and their networks.
Well, all of those are factors, of course, but I think the most important reason is a structural problem with Western media outlets. And that structural problem is that they exist to reinforce the foreign policy interests of the governments in the country that they're situated in. We've seen over many decades with the war against Korea, the US war against Vietnam, both of the two US wars against Iraq, the war in Yemen, the war in Libya, the war in Syria, that these media outlets, they spread lies and disinformation on behalf of the US government and through the mouths of anonymous US intelligence officials from the CIA and other spy agencies. And those lies are used to try to justify
those intentional leaks,
aggressive
if you will,
policies
by the White House and the CIA and the like.
Absolutely. We've seen so many cases of this, from the infamous example of the CIA claiming that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, and that was used to justify an illegal invasion of Iraq. So we see that the media plays a role as the handmaiden for the US government, and also European media outlets play the same role for European governments. And they claim to be independent, but the reality is they're not independent. So the journalists who work there, they play a role, they bear responsibility, but they're not the ones who choose their stories frequently. Frequently, it's their editors who are the ones that decide what they can publish, and their editors will not allow them to publish certain stories if it rocks the boat. If it actually, in some cases, there's also the potential possibility that they will lose access, which is a huge part of it. And this leads to self-censorship, because if you're a reporter at the New York Times and you rely on the CIA to feed you stories, you're not going to criticize the CIA, because then they might stop feeding you the stories that you publish. So we see this feedback loop where many of these Western media outlets are reliant on Western governments to feed them stories, so they're very reluctant to challenge those governments.